I'm thankful to be with you again this evening. Of course, as I've said before so many times, we look forward to the opportunity to spend time with you here at East Hill. I know I advertised that Ginger would be coming with me this evening, but she wasn't able to do that. Something had come up, so I always miss her when she's not around. And I have the idea that I don't do nearly as well when she's not around. And if you knew the full story behind why I wouldn't be very much without her, you'd agree with me. Psalm 2 tonight. We've had a reading from Psalm 2. It's so different from the psalm that we studied this morning. The psalm that we studied this morning, Psalm 1, is a general and overarching psalm. It applies almost everywhere that you can think to put an application of Christian biblical principles. It's that kind of psalm. Psalm 2 is a little bit different from that. Why do the nations rage, or why do the heathen rage? We're familiar with that translation, and that's the way it goes out throughout the literature of the world. The people imagine a vain thing. Whenever you see the word vain in the Bible, that means an empty thing. The people imagine an empty thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, "Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us." What's God's response? He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. I think especially today, as was mentioned, Johnny mentioned in our prayer, we think about what happened those 20-some years ago on 9/11. I know there's a couple of times in my life where I can definitely remember what was going on a very important, significant historical day. One of them was the assassination of President John Kennedy. I remember I was in geometry class in high school when he was killed. Never forget that. Never forget the teacher's response. Never forget the school's response. With regard to the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York City, I'll never forget that I was in class at Calhoun. I was teaching a class of history students in the 8 o'clock class in the morning, 8 going up to about 9:30. In the midst of that situation came into effect, and it changed the school's activities that day. I can assure you, it wasn't very long that the school was closed because we didn't know what else was going to happen. None of us knew what else was going to happen on that day. That, my friends, is an example of the heathen raging. What happened on that day? And any time we have an event of irrational violence, a manifestation of hatred, a significant element of destruction that happens in our culture and in our society, it is an example of what we read about here in the early part of the second psalm. You say, well, how do you figure that? Well, when he's talking about the heathen raging and people imagining a vain or an empty thing, he's talking about people acting as if they control the world as opposed to God controlling the world. Now, I know that in the example that we cited about the Twin Towers and their destruction, those people had put themselves in a position where they contended that they were working for God. They contended that they were working for their understanding of who God is, but they were not working for God, were they? Not at all. They were working for the very opposite of God. They were working for the devil. Now, you say, how do people get to the place in life where they can do things like that? You know, whether it's assassinating a president or killing an innocent person, any other act of irrational violence, certainly something like 9/11, certainly something like a war that has as its primary purpose to enlarge the borders of a specific nation. Any of those things that you and I could look at as children of God and say, that doesn't make sense. If you want your country to get bigger, there ought to be a way to do that without killing a bunch of people in order to accomplish it. And if you disagree with somebody, there ought to be a way to voice that disagreement without murdering them. And if you hate a way of life, as evidently the fellows that flew those airplanes into those buildings hated our way of life, there ought to be another way to express that without the destruction that they brought upon us, and as a result of what they did, the destruction that was brought upon themselves, which is multiplied many times over and will never be forgotten. Why do people do things that just don't make any sense like that? Well, you go back to Psalm 2, and the reason people do things like that is they don't believe in the God of the Bible. They don't believe in the true and living God. Why do the heathen rage? Why do they imagine these things? Why do they set themselves against God? Why indeed? The reason is they don't believe in God. Because if you believe in the God of the Bible, you won't do those things. And since they don't believe in the God of the Bible, they do those things. Now, when we bring this up in our world today, we have two responses. People say, well, I understand what you're saying about people acting so badly because they don't believe in God. How do you get people to believe in God that don't believe in God? How do you change the situation? It's one thing to complain about a situation. How do you change it? Well, if the problem is people don't believe in God, we have to find some way to encourage people to believe in God. And I'm not talking about just saying, I believe in God like in some sort of idolatrous way. No, I believe the God of the Bible. I believe the God of Abraham, Isaac, Moses, all that, I believe in God. How do we get people to get to that place? Now, some folks say, well, you just have to decide to believe. You just have to make up your mind that that's the position you're going to take. Is that satisfactory? Does that sound satisfactory? Don't you think there ought to be a reason, or at least one, perhaps many reasons to actually believe in God? I mean, I believe in God, don't you? Well, of course you do. You wouldn't be here tonight. Well, why? And I know you have your reasons, and you've worked through it. A crowd like this that's mature, even these little children had a pretty good idea why God is. Well, the trouble is in our world today, we want our doctors to know what they're doing, right? We want our airline pilots to know what they're doing, correct? And we even want the fellows who build the airplanes to know exactly what they're doing, don't we? And you say, well, they feel like they know what they're doing. You go to the doctor, you say, Doc, what do you think? He said, well, I don't really know. I feel like I've got a pretty good plan for you. Well, Doc, could you get just a little bit more specific? I'd like to hear something a little bit more concrete than that, We want our doctors to know what to do, particularly if you go to have surgery. Doc, how do you feel about doing this surgery? I think I can probably get it done. How many of you would stay on that table and say, well, let me just go down the hall here and see if I can find a fellow a little bit more sure of himself. That's what you'd want to do. So we want our doctors, we want our soldiers, and we want our airplane pilots. We want people like that have some significant responsibility. We want them to really know what they're doing. We believe that for them, objective truth is an absolute necessity. They need to know their job like you and I know that 2 + 2 is 4. I think most of us would agree with that. However, in our world today, when we get outside these realms of science, or applied science anyway, things like history and religion and politics and literature. Those things in our world today, among some circles, not all circles, but among some circles, they are demoted to the basement of subjectivism. In other words, in terms of religion, it's whatever you think. In terms of what a piece of literature means. Now, when I was taught literature back in the olden days, some of y'all were there with me, what we did, we studied a piece of literature in that big American literature book or that big English literature book, and what we found out was what the writer meant by the story. And we knew that other people would read the story and think it meant something else, but we wanted to know what the writer meant by the story because that's where the story started. Not so today, folks. Today, the way literature is taught in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, the way things like that, literature, religion, history, it's whatever it means to you. If it hits you a certain way, that's what it means. You know, back in the 60s, there was a really substantially good songwriter named Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell wrote songs that were called stream of consciousness songs. And people said, you know, I've looked at life from both sides now, clouds and all that stuff. And she says, people look at that and say, well, that means so much to me, and they have their own interpretation. Let me tell you something. Joni Mitchell knew what she meant when she wrote the song. Now, in our world today, we've said, oh, no, whatever literature, history, politics, whatever you want it to mean, that's what it means. And when that's ridiculous, but when it's applied to religion, it's dangerous. Because God's book doesn't mean, one passage doesn't have many meanings. It has many interpretations, but it has only one meaning, the true meaning. We may not ever even find out what that meaning is in this life, but we've got to know that it has one meaning. Jesus said in John 8:32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. You'll not know many truths, and many truths will make you free. No, it's the truth. The truth shall make you free. But then you come to this question, why did the heathen rage? They don't believe in God. Well, how can they believe in God? Is it possible for a person who doesn't believe in God to move from that position to the position of believing in God? Now, if I ask you to raise your hand if you've done that in your life, I know that there'd be more people in here besides me that have gone through that process. Because I can tell you I didn't used to believe in God. Certainly not the God of the Bible. I might have believed in some amorphous deity, but not the God of the Bible. But you can move from that place to the other place, and how can you do it? Well, first of all, we need to understand, and the Bible teaches us this. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3, it says, by faith we understand. The word know there is translated understand. Human beings can come to understand a truth about anything. I mean, that's what we're able to do. God has made us this way. And as we noted this morning from 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, we have a resource of absolute inspired truth that we can rely upon with regard to knowing what God wants us to understand. And we need to understand. God has left adequate information about himself in this world. Today, for example, as I was driving back home, the sky was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. Big, tall clouds one minute, sun blasting through the clouds the next minute, and then the next minute you had rain just falling down as fast as it could possibly fall. That's an amazing activity of God's creation. And what it ought to do, and I think one of the things it's designed to do, according to Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, is that it's designed to cause us to think about how in the world did that situation get created? Did it just pop up out of nowhere? Or because of the great organization and the substantial reality of it, did God make it? See, the world that we look at forces us in the direction of God. The Bible finishes the trip. The world, you look at the world, look at a caterpillar, look at anything, look at the birds. I mean, I was driving down the road today, coming up here, and the birds were in the road eating something. I tooted the horn, and I was on this side of the road. I thought of this morning, brother. I was on this side of the road. The birds were over here with me. Now, they didn't run off into the bushes because they wanted to come back and eat what was in the road. So what they did, they didn't even fly. They just hopped over to the others. How did they learn to do that? How did they have the capability to learn to do that? Well, they were created that way. And somebody says, well, I don't know that we can know that much. You know, how can we really know anything? As a matter of fact, there's a whole philosophical school. Now, if you've been punished by having to take philosophy in high school or college, you know this. There's a whole philosophical school that says we really don't know anything. We only know the perceptions that we have of things. In other words, according to that philosophy, and it's kind of ridiculous, and if you go to college, kids, and you take one of those, it comes into the sociology classes and the psychology classes too. Staying out of the philosophy classes won't save you. What they'll teach you is that as human beings, for instance, this desk here is pretty substantial. Do you know it's here? I know it's here. If I were to fall down and hit my head on it, I'd really know it was here. It's here. It's here. But this school of philosophy says, no, all we have is our perception of the reality of the desk. And there's no way that, say, for instance, I know what it looks like from here, but I can't know what Joe thinks it looks like because I can't get in Joe's head. Yes, I can with regard to the shape of this desk because I know what it looks like and Joe's looking at it. He's looking at the same thing I'm looking at. We can know these things. But the first step down the slippery slope of not being able to know anything for real like God exists is to say we only have perceptions of reality. We don't really understand and perceive totally what we do. Now, I know what a tree is, don't you? And I know what a forest is. What's a forest? Forest is the universals of trees. It's all the trees together. We know what our own minds are. Don't you? Don't you know what you think? That's self-consciousness. We know ourselves. I know what goes on up here. And I know what other minds think when those minds are revealed to me by the people that have those minds. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 through 13, Paul's talking to the Corinthian church about how they know what God wanted them to do. He said the Holy Spirit revealed it to us and we revealed it to you. We can know what minds know, what other people know. You have a good teacher, that teacher teaches you things and you end up knowing that person's mind. And people say, well, now, you know, we can't really be sure that we know anything. Yes, we can. It is the rejection of common sense and reality to say that we cannot know things. And if we understand that we can know things, we can know God. As we begin to try to understand the world, we explain things in terms of other things. For instance, we've been singing some songs here today. And I know this is a congregation that loves singing. Every song that you sing implies some things that are true, that you know are true, that you don't see at the moment you're singing the song. Say, what are you talking about, Bill? If you sing a song and you hear that music, you know that somebody wrote that song. Somebody wrote the lyrics. If it has lyrics, if it doesn't have lyrics, somebody wrote the melody. You're not guessing that somebody wrote a melody or that somebody wrote the lyrics. You know, if you hear a song, if you hear the music, you know that behind the music, there's at least a composer of the melody and the lyrics. Maybe more than one composer. See, looking at one thing makes us look at another thing. And that's the way it is with the evidence of the existence of God. Let me just remind you, and I know you know these things, And I appreciate you being here tonight, and perhaps it's been a long day for you. But we can use our minds that God has created. Remember, God did not haphazardly create the mind. Now, we have brains that sit on our brain pan, but our brain is not the same thing as our mind, is it? The brain's where the mind resides, at least as far as we know right now. The brain is where the mind resides while a human being is alive. All right? That mind exists. It works out rational processes. The mind is the seat of our understanding. It's the place where rational understanding begins to occur. It causes us to, makes us able to evaluate evidence and evaluate circumstances in light of the evidence that's before us. How many of you have been going down the road and everything seems to be just exactly fine? And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of your eye, you see a car making up the side road, and it becomes apparent in a split second that that person is not going to stop at the stop sign or the signal or whatever's there. And what do you find yourself doing? All of a sudden you realize that you have put the brakes on. You've started to stop your car even though you did not have the conscious thought, I better stop the car or that guy's going to run into me. You just did it. Now, my kids call that, when I do it, they call, Daddy, you've been getting jumpy. You're too jumpy. Well, I'm not jumpy. That's what my mind's doing, trying to keep those kids alive. You know what I mean? The mind is capable of understanding and absorbing the realities around us. Why do the heathen rage? Because they don't take the time to think about God. If they did, they'd realize that the existence of the world demands the existence of God. Now, there's a fancy name for that argument. It's called the cosmological argument. If the world, the cosmos, if it exists, it didn't come from nowhere. It had to come from somewhere. And since it's so massive and so amazingly huge, and everything about it is significant, the only power that could create the cosmos is absolute power, or the power of deity. See, everything that exists, it manifests what they call contingency. If something exists, then it's possible that at some point it didn't exist. As a matter of fact, it's demanded that at some point it didn't exist. If an automobile exists, there was a time it didn't exist, right? That's, if it's sitting there, you know that at one time it didn't sit there. It wasn't always there. And the world is here. And the fact that it's here indicates that at some time it wasn't here. Where did it come from? They say, well, it was all evolution. It just happened over billions and billions of years. I mean, Jean-Luc Picard can tell you that, right? Y'all do know who. Star Trek guy, all that stuff. They can tell you all that stuff, but the point is, seriously, the fact that the world is here indicates that something put it here. That's the cosmological argument for the existence of God, that the only thing that could answer that question is the all-powerful deity that we know of as God. And there's another argument that builds out of that or on that or sideways to that, and that is the argument for order. There's some jewelry up here that somebody's lost and so forth, and here's a pretty little thing, whatever it is. And where'd that come from? It looks very intricate. As a matter of fact, I've got a watch right over here. This is my favorite watch, and it's my favorite watch because it's a watch that has a mechanism in it. It doesn't run on a battery. It's a machine. But if I look at this watch, one thing I know about this watch, somebody made it. Somebody had to put it together because it's put together in a specifically ordered fashion. That's called the teleological, or the argument from order. If there's something that exists that has obviously been made, it has to have had what? A maker. If you've got a watch, you've got a watchmaker. The moral argument. Why is it that people, regardless of the system of morality that they have, why do people everywhere and in all places have a system of morality? It may not be correct. I'm not arguing that everybody has the correct system of morality. That correct system of morality is revealed here. But the fact that people want to have some system of morality, it's like people say, well, the folks in the jungle, if the cannibals, they won't eat everybody. They've got some morals. They've got some standards. They only eat certain people. Why is it certain people, not everybody? Because they've got a system. Why is it that we're built that way? We say some people, it's kind of funny, I guess, or sad, I reckon. Some people aren't very good to eat, so we won't eat them. Well, everybody has some system. Even the criminals have a moral system. I've got a dear friend down at Hobbs Street that's a warden in the prison. And let me tell you something. Prisons have moral systems within them, within the prisoners. There's certain things that they don't allow to have happen in their prison. See, everybody has a moral system. Now, to find the correct moral system, you have to go by what God says, what Jesus says. Sermon on the Mount's a good place to start. Romans chapter 12 is a beautiful place to start, to look for that specific. But the fact is, it is interesting that everyone has a moral system of some kind. Where did that come from? Probably from the nature with which we are created. And then, lastly, and there was a time in my life I didn't think much of this at all. But there's an argument for the existence of God that says if you can think about God, you ought to give consideration that that's evidence of his existence. Else, where did the thought of God come from? Why do the heathen rage? They rage because they've rejected God. And what does the Psalm say that God's going to do with regard to these individuals? Well, in verse 4, as he read earlier, he that sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. And then the psalmist says, yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. The ungodly person makes light of God, rejects God. The godly person has set his king upon his holy hill. God has set his king upon the holy hill of Zion, and we recognize that. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. See, it moves over and casts Jesus is the one saying this, or the Son of God is the one saying this. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. The heathen rage and say, oh, we're not having anything to do with God. God says, no, I'll give it all to my son. He'll have it. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. There's two ways to go in this life. We can be on God's side, or we can be on the side of evil. The choice we must make is clear. He says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that have put their trust in him. So we come to the conclusion of our brief study of the second Psalm, and we say God is, and there's plenty of evidence to understand that he is. And if you want to have the advantage, the blessing of salvation in the Son of God, you can come tonight, obey the gospel of Christ. Place yourself in a position of doing what believing in the God of the Bible actually demands. To love Him, obey Him, to live in Him. If those of you present, if any of you present need to obey the gospel, you need to come back to the Lord, we certainly do ask that you come as together we stand and sing.